Thank you very much for having me here. If you could just keep your questions till the end of the presentation. And by the way, is my voice, can everybody hear me at the back of the room? Okay, I'll stand right around here. Just, I better put my glasses on. Start with the first one. For anyone who wants to know, the Dempster Highway is located in northern Canada, and it runs from the North Klondike Highway up to Inuvik. So it crosses through the Yukon and Northwest Territories. In the fall of 2017, we heard on the media that a new road had been constructed, an all-weather road that ran from Inuvik up to Tuktoyaktuk, which is on the Beaufort Sea. We were fascinated and were very anxious to have an opportunity to go and explore some of northern Canada, as well as a chance to go up right up to the most northern community by road. With that in mind, with that in mind, we boarded a flight from to Whitehorse and then took our trip up Dempster. Just to let you know a little bit about the Dempster Highway itself, it's 740 kilometers long. It was opened in August of 18th of 1979, 20 years after the initial preliminary studies and talk about developing it. There were lots of setbacks due to political disputes over the territories, as well as problems building on permafrost. It was finally completed, and it connects the Klondike Highway to Inuvik. And as I mentioned earlier, in the fall of 2017, a continuation road was built from Inuvik up to Tuktoyaktuk. That would be an all-weather road. Prior to that, Tuktoyaktuk was only accessible via plane or an ice highway in the wintertime. The first part of our trip was from Dawson City up to Eagle Plains. So what we did was we flew up to Whitehorse, rented an SUV at the airport, and then drove up along the North Klondike to Dawson City. And we spent a few days in Dawson, familiarizing ourselves with the environment and getting some information about the local flora and fauna, and then set out to up the Dempster. When we were in Dawson, it was lovely, hot, sunny weather. But the day we set out to drive up the Dempster, it had turned overcast and cool and rainy. We drove 40 kilometers down the North Klondike to the point at which there's a juncture with the start of the Dempster Highway. At that junction point, they have an information board that provides with all sorts of information about the history of building the highway, as well as information about the indigenous peoples of the area, and the geology, and something about the birds and nature. Next to this information board was an electronic board that was set up, which stated very clearly that about 150 kilometers up the road, due to the heavy rains, there had been two mudslides, and the road was closed. We decided we would continue up the road as far as we could go, and then turn back to Dawson for the evening. We'd come this far, we wanted to see something of the Dempster Highway. The Dempster itself, the highway, as I mentioned, was built on permafrost. So they built most of the highway in the winter time, and they took just truckloads of gravel and shale and dumped them directly on top of all the trees, shrubs, and grasses that were growing there. The feeling being that that would create that much more insulation to prevent the permafrost from melting. Unfortunately, with climate change and the warming temperatures, the permafrost is melting faster than anticipated, and so if this was a frequent sight on the roads. These maintenance trucks going back and forth, smoothing the road down and putting more layers of gravel on it. By the way, the Dempster Highway is gravel all the way up to Inuvik, for anyone who's thinking about driving on it. About 70 kilometers along the highway, we stopped in the parking lot of the Tombstone Territorial Park. They have a visitor center there. It was muddy driving on the Dempster. As you can see, most of the cars have mud on them, and it's quite slippery because of the shale and gravel and mud on the road. We stopped in at the center, the visitor center, to get an update on road conditions and also to see whether or not the highway had been cleared. They told us that yes, indeed, there were work crews busy working to try and clear things, but so far it was still shut. We decided to continue on as far as the closure, and then at that point turn around. Just beyond the visitor center was a Tombstone Range viewpoint, and in the distance there are the Tombstone Mountains, one series of the mountains there along the road. Now the Dempster Highway crosses through area that was 190 million years ago the edge of our country, of Canada, and the Beaufort Sea came up to that area. Now, since then, with the warming of climates and so on, and ice has advanced and receded again, and you now have it as land in that area. It's also the edge of what's called the Beringia Range, East Beringia, and Beringia is that area of the area of land that has now resulted from the water levels dropping, and that was in place about 3 million years ago, and plants and animals and insects moved from Eurasia over to North America, and conversely the other way around. So that's why we ended up with mammoths and bison and so forth in North America. And interestingly, camels actually originated in North America, and they in turn moved across this this pathway to Eurasia, and of course they become extinct in North America now. Another view of the Tombstone Range. We were driving, and I became aware of a northern harrier flying close to the tundra, and it seemed to be chasing something. And sure enough, there was a red fox with a willow ptarmigan in its mouth. So obviously, the northern harrier and the fox were both interested in the same dinner. Driving a little bit further, we came to what's called North Fork Pass Summit. This is the highest area on the Dempster Highway, and it's also an area that's continuous permafrost with lichen growing on the ground and shale. It's a perfect area for the Dowell sheep, especially for the purpose for lambing. And so it's a nursery there along the rocks for them to have their lambs. I put red arrows in case you couldn't see them because they're very closely blended with the rocks on the slopes. There were a lot of golden eagles flying around, eager to find any lamb that had been left unattended. And they also, as I tried to come closer to them, they were very skittish, and they all moved very further up the slopes from me. So didn't get very close pictures of them. There were lots of northern harriers flying around overhead in search of small animals. It's also, this part of the Dempster is rich with bird life, and so there are many lakes and ponds on either side of the road, and frequently seen red-throated loons and willow ptarmigans running on the road. Again, too, caught once more by the camera. And we also came up to the aptly named Two Moose Lake, where a bull moose was busy eating reeds along the side of the lake. And Bufflehead's mother and juveniles also in the water there. And another picture of just some of the mountain ranges we passed along the Dempster. By this point in time, we were getting fairly close to where the mudslide had occurred, and we were seeing more and more service vehicles coming towards us on the other side of the road, back and forth as they were trying to clear the mudslide. There were also a number of camper vans that had parked in one of the campsites along the Dempster. There's 9 of them in total, 9 campsites, that is. And it was at this point we were moving very cautiously because it was quite muddy and slippery on the road. And, as you can see on the map, we're now about a quarter of the way along the Dempster Highway where the mudslide had occurred. And just as we came up to the barriers that had been laid across the highway, they were in the process of removing the barriers. So just our luck that we happened to come up there just as they had cleared enough of the highway to let vehicles. And as you can see, they were busy with their chainsaws cutting back some of the trees that had been pulled down with the mud across the road. And at that point in time, they had just cleared half of the highway. So we were all very carefully maneuvering our way around the mud and to move on further down the road along the Dempster. Quite a muddy business there. At this point in time, we had reached the border of the Tombstone Territorial Park, and this is the wintering habitat for the porcupine caribou. It's also the First Nations subsistence hunters, although the caribou are protected, the First Nations subsistence hunters hunt them year-round. Also, the highway is used as an airstrip in several areas. These were set up at the time when they were building the highway itself, and they've since left them in place for emergency landings when needed. So airplanes will actually use the highway itself for their landing strip. There was also areas and slopes, one area in particular concentrated of tours, and they're caused by water getting into cracks in the rock and then freezing and then shattering. And it presents these, I don't know if you can see these sort of little spikes and so on the tops of the rocks and down the sides of them. This only occurs in unglaciated rocks. We then came to an area, this is all as we're driving along the Dempster, where the permafrost was quite deep and was quite far down, which allowed for a period of soil, and so therefore the tree roots could grow deeper. And these trees that look tiny have actually been around for many hundreds of years, but they just don't grow very tall in that sort of climate. But this was a forest fire, one of several that we saw along the roadside. They're naturally occurring, usually caused by lightning strikes. Unfortunately, again, with global warming, they have become more frequent and they cover a larger area of territory now. With forest fires, they burn all the trees there as well as the lichen underneath, which is not a great thing for the caribou who are relying on that for their winter feeding. But on the other hand, by burning all of that away, it allows the willows to grow, which are one of the foods that the moose rely on for their feed. We were coming up to the area where it's quite a 300-meter climb up to Eagle Plains, and as you can see, it's quite muddy on the hills going up, and made it a bit trickier, sort of sliding across the road. So it was good that there wasn't a whole lot of traffic actually. We had to keep our eye out for cyclists. So that we passed several of them biking up to Tuktoyaktuk and back. The Eagle Plains Plateau is 200 kilometers wide, made of sandstone, and it has a permafrost and very, very little vegetation on it. So it's not, there's not a lot of wildlife on the Eagle Plains Plateau. But at this point, we're crossing the Continental Divide, which meant that the water on the right-hand side of the road was flowing north to the Beaufort Sea, and the water on the left-hand side of the road was flowing southwest to the Bering Sea. And at that point in time, we were at Eagle Plains, which is halfway up the Dempster Highway. So in our first day, we had done 400 kilometers from Dawson City up to Eagle Plains. And Eagle Plains Hotel was where we were aiming for the night. We were not camping out. It was built in 1978. It was a bit of an engineering challenge, and they were able to find a piece of bedrock that had surfaced, and they could use that as a platform for building the hotel. But there's also a helicopter pad, a gas station, a mechanic shop, a bar, a restaurant, as well as a camper van park there. It was built the year before the highway was opened, and it's open year-round with a population of 9. We took advantage of their free water to clean down the car and to get some of the mud off it so that we could see something as we were driving. And then we headed to the hotel, as did everyone else who drives, who goes on the Dempster. You're either camping out or you're staying at the Eagle Plains Hotel because there's nothing else to stay at. And we had a hot meal in their dining room, and then after that, we're talking with a few fellow travelers in their front lobby. And one woman we met was in her mid-50s, and she was from San Francisco. She had flown up to Vancouver and then had been biking from there, bicycling, and she had got up to Tuk already, and she was on her return trip. She was mostly camping out and on the sides of the road, I guess. But she had, I guess, decided to stay there for the night to have a shower and a hot meal and probably a warm bed. She was busy packing her things up to continue her trip back down the Dempster, but was somewhat reluctant to get going, not surprisingly, because by that time it was pouring with rain outside. But anyway, eventually she set off, and we went to bed, and you could hear the thunder crashing and lots of rain outside. Interestingly, the next morning was bright and sunny, and the road was completely dry. So very good drainage on the road. And a white-crowned sparrow was there to say goodbye to us as we headed off. We were within about 36 kilometers, well, in fact, 36 kilometers from Eagle Plains. We hit the Arctic Circle, which is in the Yukon territories. There's a signboard there with all sorts of information about the land and again the First Nations and so on. It's of course known as the land of the midnight sun. On June 22nd, the sun doesn't fall below the horizon. It's also an area where you can see for miles. It's a winter range for the porcupine caribou as well. It's popular for short-eared owls and the grizzlies, who were supposedly all there, but we didn't see any. But they would be very, very well camouflaged in that area. And as you can see, more pictures of the landscape there. And as you can see, the Dempster highway. That is the highway there. And shortly thereafter, so 60 kilometers beyond, we hit the Yukon Northwest Territory boundary. Again, another notice board with information about the area. And interestingly, at this point in time, the highway distance markers, which were green, turned to blue, and they started again at 0 kilometers. as soon as you hit the Northwest Territories. You're also moving into Mountain Standard Time, so you put your clocks ahead by an hour. We also noticed that the surface of the road was much better. There was better gravel and it was better maintained, probably because the Northwest Territories doesn't have as many highways to maintain. There was a porcupine sort of sunning itself next to the signboard, and it was obviously quite sleepy because it allowed me to get quite close to it for photos. Yeah. At this point, we were passing through the Richardson Mountains, which are made of dark shale and sandstone. They're the most northerly extension of the Rocky Mountains. They were named by Sir John Franklin, the explorer, for his friend, Dr. John Richardson, who was a surgeon but a botanist as well. And he would accompany Franklin on his land explorations. Another picture of the Richardson Mountains there. And as well in that area, there were a lot of lakes that were scattered around, created during the last ice age. We were now passing through the Richardson Mountains and descending down to the Peel River. And one of the few cyclists that we met along the way, busy, I guess, making his way to Innervik. When we got to the Peel River, there was a cable ferry there to take us across to the continuation, as you can see on the other side, of the Richardson Highway. The cable ferry is indeed, you cross on a cable. It's pulled on a cable. It is open from mid-May till the end of October, and from 9 in the morning until just after midnight each day. In the winter months, they use the ice highway, so the Peel River is covered with ice, and you just drive across. The river itself is very good for fishing. So the local Gwowichan communities were there with their fishing nets, catching whitefish, which were running at the time. And what they would do is fillet them, hang them out to dry, and then smoke them and have them as part of their winter food. Also fishing were baldy, ravens, and herring gulls. When we got across the river, then we, soon after that, we hit Fort McPherson, which was at one time, or started out as a Hudson's Bay post, but today is now the Tetlin-Gwowichan community with a population of 900. They have a hotel at Fort McPherson, so anyone who isn't able to get in or doesn't want to stay at Eagle Plains Hotel has the option of staying in Fort McPherson. We went into the town. They've got just to have a look around, and they have a cemetery there as well as a small church. And in the cemetery, they have the burial ground for the Lost Patrol. Now, the Lost Patrol or at least in the early 1900s, the Northwest Mounted Police used to send out a patrol in the winter months. And they would start usually in Dawson City and go by dog sled up to Fort McPherson, and also include a trip out to Herschel Island, which is on the Beaufort Sea. So they'd sort of do a bit of a triangle of the area, and they would use that as a way of enforcing the law, as well as bringing mail and information to those local communities, and just to make sure, just to check on the general welfare of the communities themselves. In this particular year, 1910 to 11, they, for whatever reason, decided to start the patrol from Fort McPherson instead. And so they started with a local Indigenous guide, but parted company because one member of the patrol said, well, I know how to get back and forth. I've done this trip last year, except that they had done it starting in Dawson City. Soon after, they lost their way, and when they realized they didn't know how to get further on to Dawson, they turned around and tried to make their way back to Fort McPherson, but by this time they'd run out of food. They killed a few of the dogs ate them and were still didn't have enough food, and and also died from exposure to the cold. When they didn't show up in Dawson City, then they sent another patrol out, led by Corporal Jack Dawson, for whom the highway is named. And he recovered their bodies and brought them back to Fort McPherson, where they're buried with a memorial. They continued with the winter patrols until about the mid-1930s, but they always made sure after that to bring an Indigenous guide along, and they put, clearly marked the trail itself. So from Fort McPherson, we came up to the second of the rivers to cross, and this is the second ferry crossing. It's the confluence of the Mackenzie and Arctic Red Rivers. And the ferry itself not only services the Dempster Highway back and forth, but also the Gouache community of Sketchik, or mouth, in English known as mouth of the Iron River. And you can see down on the bank there, the river bank, there are a number of fishing camps. These are the locals out fishing on the river itself. And this is a Louis Cardinal ferry that took us across the river, much larger ferry than the last one. Just above the cars on the iron girders of the ferry, there were cliff swallows had nested. And as the ferry plied across the waters, these swallows were swooping back and forth, catching insects off the water and feeding them to their young. So it was quite a sight to see. Once we crossed the river, then it was another about 2 hours up to Inuvik. Now, this area of the Dempster, it starts to get quite flat and maybe not as exciting, dare I say. There are lots of lakes and rivers and so forth around along the way. But anyway, so Inuvik was created in 1953. I don't know if anyone's too familiar with the background behind it, but it was created as a replacement settlement for Aklavik, which was prone to flooding. As you can see, Aklavik on the map as well. Initially the economy was supported by some oil exploration up in the Beaufort Sea, but when that dried up and the oil companies moved out, since that time, or at least today, it's really, the economy consists of a small tourist industry and government subsidies, as well as the regional hospital where a number of people work. It's mostly Indigenous living in Inuvik, and the population is shrinking. We stayed a few days in Inuvik, and as you can see, there's a big sign there saying the end of the Dempster. It was also the first time we had hit paved roads for a while, so that was a bit of a relief. Inuvik itself is built, all the houses and buildings are on stilts because it's built on permafrost. And as well, the water and sewage is carried from house to house and building to building by utilidors, which are above ground pipes. They also have an igloo church, or Our Lady of Victory Church, and the most northerly mosque in Canada. As well, they have a community greenhouse there that has, the plants grow very well because of all of the daylight hours in the summer. Now, this community greenhouse was built in an abandoned hockey arena that was part of the now no longer, the now demolished residential school that was in the town. And there were some bad feelings amongst the Indigenous living there about the hockey arena. So they're hoping by producing things in their flowers and vegetables and so on that might create a more positive image for it. They also in Inuvik host the Northern Arts Festival in the summertime, where artists from across the north come together to display their wares and demonstrate their crafts and so on. And so they would and they'll also sell their artworks and carvings and clothing and so on. Indian paintbrush was one of the flowers that are quite commonly seen along the roadsides in the area. So we stayed a few days in and then continued on to Tuk. Now we had to Tuktoyaktuk on this new road. Now Tuktoyaktuk is 150 kilometers from Inuvik. So most of the tourists that are going up there do it as a day trip, and then they come back to Inuvik for the evening. Part of the reason for this is because there's no restaurants, cafes, and hotels in Tuk. However, we had been able to find one of just a scattering of Airbnbs that were available in Tuk, so we had made arrangements to stay there for a few days. Driving along the road up to Tuk, you're going across the Mackenzie Delta. Now, the Mackenzie River is 4,200 kilometers in length. It's the longest river in Canada, and it stretches from northern BC up to the Beaufort Sea. And its watershed comprises 1/5 of Canada's land. So that is what you're driving across there. So there were many, many lakes and rivers and streams and ponds. And it seemed that on every pond and lake, there was a resident tundra swan or family, and in case you haven't spotted, there were 2 babies. Also driving along there, we passed Inuit wooden dog sleds. These were either just parked there for the summertime, or they were abandoned because now they've got superior ATVs and so on to use instead. As we got close to Tuk, we passed the pingos, and pingos are basically frost heaving. They come up through the permafrost, and these consist of mounds of ice covered with earth. The area around Tuk has the largest concentration of pingos in the world, and a number of them are protected by the government. We also pass a number of times sandhill cranes that have obviously migrated up there for the summer months, as well as lesser scops. And as you can see where we now are on the map, we're up at Tuktoyaktuk, which is translated into "it looks like a caribou." And it is situated on the Beaufort Sea. At the very top of the town of Tuk, there's the point, and the point actually sticks out into the Arctic Ocean. So we have a pingo in the background, not the foreground, and we have a sign for Tuktoyaktuk there, which is just outside the town. As I say, it's 140 kilometers north of Inuvik, and it's an Inuit community of 900. So the buildings in Tuk are around a natural harbor or bay just off the Beaufort Sea, and they're grouped around there on stilts. And you can see some of the driftwood. There was lots of driftwood that had come from the Beaufort Sea and landed in that area. And some of the larger buildings there are the 2 grocery stores in the north, which are, one of them is Northern and its competitor is Stanton, and or there's also some government buildings up in the area. So we drove out to the Arctic Ocean. There's a big sign to let you know that, and it's on the point. And we did as all tourists do and put our hands into the ocean. And there was one brave tourist who donned a wetsuit, and she was swimming there. Also in the curve, out there on the point, and there was a long-tailed jaeger passing by, as well as local the Inuit families who put their fishing nets out into the water. And as I said, the whitefish were running at this time, so they were quite busy down there pulling in the nets. And they work rather like a pulley system, like a clothesline outside. So as they're pulling in the fishing nets to collect the fish, another net is being sent out into the water. One grandfather there who was busy checking the nets for his family, and he brought all his equipment with him, so he'd pull in the whitefish, and then he would fill it, dry, and smoke them right there on the beach. And this was a very typical fish drying smoking shed. Every family had one, and they'd all decorate them with their recent hunts. They were also, besides drying fish, they would also use them for drying meat in the wintertime, or for the winter months. There were lots of glaucous gulls eager to get any scraps of fish or anything else that they happened to be thrown their way, as well as the ground squirrels, or seek as they're called up there. Quite curious, and there were lots of them around, all having a comment to make. They're very noisy. We then drove over to some of the ponds close by to look at the bird life in the area, and there was a lesser yellow legs. They do tend to be well camouflaged. So a Lapland longspur, a stilt sandpipers, northern pintail, a semi-palmated sandpiper, and a white crowned sparrow juvenile there. As well, they had a lot of Arctic cotton or tundra grass. Now, the indigenous would have used that in the past they would spin it together and use it for some of their clothing, because it is very much, when you feel it, it's very much like cotton itself. So we were up in Tuck for a few days, lots of other information about it, but that won't be in this presentation today. And and then we had to head back down to catch our airplane back out of Whitehorse. And so the day we set out to head down, the highway was hot and sunny and dry, and we thought, perfect, it'll be nice and easy driving. We hadn't anticipated the clouds of dust that would come up from the trucks as they passed us. So we learned very quickly to try and get ourselves ahead of the other cars and be the first in line in the clear view down the road. Luckily, there wasn't too much traffic on the road itself. And we're heading back down from Tuck back down the road to Inuvik there. That's the end of my presentation, but I've got I have just a few sheets with information about the Yukon and Northwest Territories, some of the sites, websites, and for anyone who's interested in going on the trip themselves. There are 9 campgrounds if one wanted to go by either camper van or bicycle. As well, there's a very excellent Dempster Highway travelogue that can be downloaded, and if when we're driving up the Dempster, it gives you information on kilometer by kilometer about the local history, geology, the bird life, the plants, and so on along the way. Excellent piece of information there. And that is it. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any, or as I say, Richard could answer anything about birds that you might have. Okay. Are there any questions? Yes. Oh, I am so sorry. I thought I had said that at the beginning. My apologies. The question is, what time of year was I there? We went in July. So if you were to go up the Dempster, it's recommended you probably go June, July, August. It does start to, you want to be careful about the snow and so on. When we were in Dawson City, they had actually a visitor center there dedicated to the Dempster Highway, and it's well worth going in to check because they've got information about highway conditions as well as places to stay and so on. And yes.
Insects.
What, mosquitoes? Oh yes, yes. Well, they were horrific up there. Up in Tuck, yes. We ended up actually. The first day we were up there was overcast and wet and rainy, and it was actually, although it was cool, it was a perfect day for walking around. The next day we woke up, it was bright and sunny, and we thought, great, we'll go out, and it was hot. It was 30 degrees. The minute we stepped outside, we were covered with mosquitoes. So the first thing we did was make our way to the grocery store to get insect repellent, sold out. So we ended up getting a net, a mosquito net for our heads, and we just made sure the rest of us were covered up. But we noticed that all the locals were also wearing mosquito nets all over them. So they really are quite bad in July. I gather they said that things get better in August, that the mosquitoes die off. But anyway, yes, they are. That's why they protect some of them, because there are actually some pingos in Tuck itself, and people walk and climb on them. Well, obviously, the more you do that, then the ice underneath melts. So yeah, so they're trying to keep some of those away from people climbing. Yes.
How many hours did you spend driving each day between Dawson and
Well, let's see. Dawson, we started 20. Was it? Well, that was in total. We didn't drive 20 hours in one day.
we're doing it next month?
Oh, you are in June.
In June.
Okay, good for you. Yes, yeah. Okay, so 20 hours total, right? It's somewhat the conditions weather dependent, and depends on how many times you want to stop. On the way up, we stopped at various points. Okay, excellent. Yes, yes, that's a must. We did have, when we were there, and it was this terrific thunderstorms and so on. We saw this bus come up, and it was a bus of elders, but I guess they hadn't booked, and they were fully booked up at the Eagle Plains, so they had no choice. It was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. They had no choice but to just keep driving till they got to the end of the Dempster. There was nowhere else for them to go unless they turned back, and if there happened to be anything at Fort McPherson. So a bit tough. Yeah, yeah. I think it's wise to book ahead. Yes. Well, the Indigenous certainly in Fort up in Inuvik, they are struggling. They're struggling there, and that's why I think you're having them leave the community. Um, if you're looking at Tuktoyaktuk, well, that was every person we approached there, every male identified themselves as a hunter. So that is a community that has been there. They do have government subsidized. They are government subsidized, but they hunt for their food, and when before the road was set up, that was where they were living. So I would say that as far as I'm concerned, they would just continue to do so. Now the children, of course, if they want to continue on with their education beyond, I think even primary school, they have to go out of the community. And which some of them do, particularly if they want to go on to university or college and so on, then they're looking at going down to some of them are going down to Victoria as well, that far down south. So yes, a hockey arena that belonged to the residential school. That's right. Yeah. Also, too, I don't know that they would have the funding really for some of those programs. They're not. Inuvik has, a number of people that I would say are pretty subsistence. They're And so what they were growing in the community greenhouse, a number of the plots were dedicated to growing vegetables for the local food banks. And we saw, we met up with some people, and of course, alcohol does play, a bit of a part there as well. That is a problem as well. Yes. Okay, so the question was that the Americans are disputing the rights over the Arctic sovereignty, which was a recent thing that had come up. I mean, perhaps some of that was Trump, but anyway. And there's a question as to whether the Inuit identify themselves as Canadian. Is that correct? Yes. We didn't actually pose that to them. But what I would have to say is that I've noticed living on the West Coast that a lot of the indigenous, I mean, they don't necessarily see themselves as boundaries in the same way as we do with provinces, and here's this province, and there's you're from Saskatchewan, you're from BC, and so on. They tend to look at themselves in terms of where their tribes are, where their peoples come from, and that could be up and down, or across or something, So they don't, whether they, I would think that they probably still, I don't know whether they would, what do you think, Richard? Would they identify themselves as Canadians? Yeah, okay, so, I guess. That's a very good question. I mean, or do they just identify themselves as Inuit, Pardon me? They're afraid of, I mean, one of the things that we did notice up in Tuck was that a number of the younger people were quite anxious to and make, should we say, make a buck off the tourists that are coming up, and they were quite eager to sort of to learn more from tourists, and also interested in moving out of the community perhaps. Some of the older ones, I think, were a little apprehensive about this new road because what was happening, and this was, they haven't got things set up yet to accommodate tourists, and so a lot of camper vans, there's no parking set up for them yet, so they were parking on the point, and this is kind of almost a very important area for the Inuit in terms of they fish off the point, and there's sort of a certain, I wouldn't say religious, but a certain significance for them. And then all of a sudden they got all these camper vans there, and there's no facilities. They only had one sort of Johnny on the spot out on the point there, and so I think some of the elders were too keen on this influx of people from the south coming up into their community. Yes.
You said that the name Tuckeyapta means it looks like a arrow.
Yes, that's correct.
That doesn't shape the land in which the community is situated.
Well, no, apparently, as legend has it, a woman looked up and saw these caribou crossing into the water, and as they were crossing, they turned into stone, and this would be off the point, and in low tide, you can see these sort of stones or rocky outcrops that look like caribou, is the interpretation I got, yes. Um, Well, one of the things we found when we went up there was that, and in fact, they warned us ahead of time when we were in Inuvik at the tourist center. They said, if you are offended by this, don't go up to Tuck right now. It was a beluga harvesting time. And so the beluga whales were passing through. We saw very, very distant, you could see the below from the belugas, but the boats were going out. They were very quiet. Up in Tuck, the residents themselves were well aware that this was not something that people from the south or tourists would take to kindly. We did, however, see a couple of young men were in their backyard at their hut cutting up one of the beluga whales. So we stopped to talk with them, and they had what they do. They go out and they catch the beluga, they harpoon the beluga, and then they sort of basically fillet it. They cut the sides off, and then they leave the rest of it there. And their feeling is that that's feeding the other fish and so on. They are not using the other parts of the beluga, so they just literally, while they're out there, they cut off the parts that they are going to consume and then just leave the rest of the carcass in the water. It certainly makes it easier for them because they're just going out in small boats. And so they were busy cutting those up and cutting the blubber off and putting that in oil and so on for the winter. But as we were talking with them, their father came home, and he just, just asked us immediately to leave. I think he was quite concerned that we might be part of some, ecology society or something, and that we would, have pictures of. I didn't take any photos. In fact, he'd made that quite clear that no photos were to be taken either. So they're very aware, very sensitive to the fact that this may not be seen as something positive by other people. Yes. Oh, there's lots of English up there. Well, yeah, yes, especially amongst some of them who are, as I say, who are eager to sort of welcoming this entrepreneurial thing there. I wouldn't be surprised if some coffee shops and restaurants start up. In fact, there was one young man we went over every day we were there to his place to have what he called a beluga burger. They were actually muskox burgers. He'd set up this little tent, a little entrepreneur, and he was making these hamburgers on his in-laws. They had a little they had a barbecue, and he was busy cooking these up in this tiny little tent for people trying to start up an industry, a hamburger shack, I guess, up there. So. Yes, yeah. No, not yet. Don't forget, this is very new for them. The highway has just been. It hasn't even September 2017, so it's just been over a year open. Yeah, so. It didn't, I mean, people had gone up to the communities before, but you had to fly up mostly, which would be very expensive. Yes. Yes, that's correct. It just means that was, Richard? It means that it was, in unglaciated areas, it just means that there was water available. It wasn't ice. I mean, it was the water which froze in them, so the water had come from the sky and froze it and then cracked them open, as opposed to it being from ice from a glacier that it created that. That's correct. Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Yes, rain coming down and then getting into fissures in the rock, freezing and then shattering the rock itself. Yes. Yes. Let me try and think what it was. Oh, there wasn't any. That's easy. Yeah, there. The Eagle planes, they use the oh, it wasn't so. It was they had their own phones. There was no. There was. I mean, I couldn't use my cell phone there. Yeah. There you go. Yeah, keep hitting this thing. That's exactly it. Yeah, we didn't bother paying the $5, but yeah, I would not. Don't please don't rely on it. If you get it, it's a bonus. So, but no, we it didn't really. Yes, exactly. It's absolutely. They do have. The trucks that are maintenance trucks and so on going up and down the road. And, someone there would obviously see you and contact if you needed help. Yes. Yes.
From Dawson, return to Dawson, what was your timeline?
You mean from Tuck?
Yeah, for the whole trip.
Oh, we were, yeah, because we stopped a couple of days in. Well, if you were to do it straight through, it was one day there, 1, 2, 3, 4 days, I guess. Yeah. Oh, we stayed 2 weeks. Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you were trying to get a sense as to how long it would take you to go up there. You could do it all in one day if you wanted, but yeah. No, we didn't. However, that is one of the things that they highly recommend. First of all, when we went to rent a car, it had to be, they wouldn't rent to us unless it was an SUV or a four-wheel drive. That's not to say that people don't take smaller cars in that on, but we only saw one small car on the road. Most of them were trucks, camper vans, motorcycles, and everybody had a spare tire, at least one spare tire, plus extra fuel as well, because there's no gas stations. You can fill up right at the junction point, the start of the Dempster Highway, and then the next time would be at Eagle Plains, and then after that, you're up to. I think there was probably one at yes, there was one at Fort McPherson as well, and then beyond that, it would be at Inuvik. So, yeah. Yes. Sorry, you. Yes. Well, right now they just keep putting layers of gravel on there and smoothing them out. But that's a good question. I don't know whether at some point in the future, whether they would consider paving it at any point in time, whether they could even possibly do that. That whole, in fact, the whole of the north, it's a bit of a concern because in Tuck itself, on the other side of the point where the camper vans were parked, there were down on the beach itself big concrete slabs, and they had been placed there in order to try and shore up the beach to prevent it from being eroded away. And what's happening is that with climate change, then the ice is melting and the sea is rising once again, the Beaufort Sea, and there's some concern. There was a newspaper article in the Globe, in fact, about it, that at some point in the future, Tuck may no longer exist because the water will just come up that high. So, that's a very good question. I don't honestly know what the long range forecast, I guess, would be. So, yes. That is one of the issues. It's hard for them to get high grade gravel up there. So some of the roads have larger stones on them, which cause tire punctures if you're not careful. As well, with all the gravel, this was another thing we did do is we took out windshield insurance. We have traveled up we traveled up through northern BC after we drove from Victoria up to Whitehorse the year before, and it's you just can't help it. You get cracked windshields, and everyone up there just drives with some cars are just covered in cracks in their windshields because it happens all the time. Yeah, so it's probably a wise idea to take out insurance if you're renting a vehicle up there. Yes. Yes, it is very much higher. That's why in those northern communities, the indigenous are subsidized. They get quite a few subsidies because, yes, the food is terribly expensive there. And everything, in fact, the gas to heat the homes, yeah, it's all just that much more expensive than down here. So. And interestingly, in the grocery stores, uh, there's no meat. Well, not interesting, I suppose it's to be expected. Certainly in Tuck, there's no meat in the meat section because they all hunt. And so I think we saw I mean, frozen hamburgers at some ungodly expensive price here. So, anyway, I guess we should probably tie it up here, should we?
Yeah, well, I think as someone who's only been on a handful of planes and has only been as far west as Winnipeg, I learned a lot. And I learned a lot from any of these talks where someone travels abroad. So if you've ever traveled somewhere and would like to give a presentation or have one coming up, we'll be doing more talks from September and beyond. But I think we all learned a few things tonight. So on behalf of the Naturalist Club, Richard, Jessica, thank you very much.